as Dumbledore might say, in the fullness of time as you get older or slightly more interested in national news, you may wonder, what is the difference between the Washington Post and the New York Times? Is there any difference between these two great canons of American media? Well, there are a few differences, and I'm going to deal mainly with objective differences rather than the subjective, oh, they have a political bent this way or that way. This will be a never-ending argument. So let's just focus on some objective criteria that we can use to distinguish the difference between the Washington Post and the New York Times. The first being, while they both have roughly the same monthly readership, around 90 million readers, the Washington Post has 1.5 million paying subscribers. The New York Times has 3 million paying subscribers. So the New York Times has twice as many paid subscribers as the Washington Post does. And to add to that, the New York Times also has, even in 2019, an additional 1 million paying subscribers for physical copies of the New York Times. So altogether, that's 4 million for the New York Times. If you would add the physical copy subscriptions for the Washington Post, around 500,000, that's 2 million. So the New York Times has twice as many paying subscribers as the Washington Post does, which means, ultimately, twice the amount of money. But it goes beyond that. While they each average around 1 billion page views a month, their strategies to how to get those page views are slightly different. The Washington Post is more focused on getting audiences through social platforms. In fact, they take a more modern approach than the New York Times does in many ways. They take a more Vice, BuzzFeed. You're more likely to see the Washington Post articles on your Facebook feed, your Instagram, your Twitter, and that's partly because while the New York Times puts out 250 articles a day, that's 250 different pieces of news every day the New York Times puts out, the Washington Post puts out 500 pieces of news a day. 500 articles a day, twice as much content the Washington Post puts out than the New York Times, and they do this through a variety of different ways. One, they have more writers putting out digital content, but two, they're more willing to accept opinion editorial content. They're more welcome to people outside the newsroom submitting content that they will then run as op-eds, and you will see many op-eds from contributing writers in the Washington Post than you will in the New York Times. This is just a quirk or idiosyncrasy of the Washington Post, but it also helps them generate much more content. Another difference that you may not be aware of, while the Washington Post is of course owned by Jeff Bezos, the kind of billionaire benefactor, the New York Times is a publicly traded company. That's right, you can buy stock in the New York Times. Is it worth it? I don't know. Not going to say one way or another on that. But there is a caveat to the New York Times being a publicly traded company. There are in fact two types of shares in the New York Times. There's Class A and Class B. And while Class A shares, you and I can go out and purchase on the stock market, the majority of Class B shares, which are the controlling shares in the company, are owned by the Ock-Schultzberger family and have been for over 100 years. That's basically the family that started the New York Times, and they retain the controlling stakeholdership of that company. So, in reality, the New York Times is controlled not unlike a private company by a specific family and has been for a long time. So while it is a publicly traded company, does it operate like a publicly traded company like General Electric does? No, not at all. Not at all. You cannot buy Class B shares of the New York Times. That is controlled by the family and they're not selling them. The third objective difference between the Washington Post and the New York Times is that even with inside media itself, most would concede that the Washington Post is slightly better. They have a slight edge on political news coverage. They're slightly better at it. In fact, it was the Washington Post that, of course, broke the famous Watergate scandal and were the ones that ran the famous Pentagon Papers. So they both have a lineage of getting great political scoops and have a slight higher prestige in that. Nonetheless, the New York Times has a slightly larger international appeal. It has 14% of its entire audience is international subscribers and runs many more stories focused on international news. Now, this is also a part of where they're based. The Washington Post is, of course, based in Washington, D.C., and the New York Times is based in Manhattan, New York. And this, in turn, shapes their perspective and their coverage. In many ways, the Washington Post is better at politics because it's in D.C., and the New York Times is slightly better at international news because it's in Manhattan, the more multicultural city of the two. So in the end, what's the best way to think about the Washington Post and the New York Times? Well, I feel like they're a bit like Oasis. Combined, they are the best American media news institution we've got. And separate, they each have their own skill set. The Washington Post is like Liam Gallagher. Within politics, it is the best. Liam Gallagher is the best singer, but for everything else, Noel Gallagher proved to be the better songwriter, the better live show, and more interested in making lots of different types of music. I think that's a fair comparison for the New York Times. The New York Times is Noel Gallagher, and the Washington Post would be Liam Gallagher. What do you guys think of that analogy? I actually think that's a pretty good one. It's a good way of thinking about the Washington Post and the New York Times. Together, combined, they account for basically all the news we consume in the United States as American news consumers. Separate, they each have their own pros and cons. Hopefully you found this interesting or insightful. Of course, there are many more nuanced differences between the two that could be argued over subjectively for as long as Noah sat in his ark. But I'm trying to stick to objective criteria and hopefully keep out the flame war. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.